Avasti, mateys! I'm Pirate Pat. Miss Kennedy was too busy to come in today, so she asked me to come in her place, and I volunteered. I'm Pirate Pat, Scourge of the Seas, or whatever body of water you have around here. Scourge of the Fish Tank. She made me watch all the videos yesterday, so I'm ready to go and read with you today. And I was looking at the last video, and it had our red-headed league story and how we've got Mr. Jabez Wilson with fiery red hair who's been helped by his assistant, Mr. Spaulding, into some sort of red-headed league. And then suddenly, 8 weeks later, they disappear. And he's wondering where they went. So he's asked our detective, Sherlock Holmes, to help him figure out what happened to the red-headed league. All right. Clear my throat. Red-headed league? Asked Watson. Yes. And you asked directions of him, merely to see what he looked like? Not him, said Holmes. Rather, the knees of his trousers. And I saw exactly what I expected to see. And why did you tap on the pavement? That will come later, my dear Watson. For now, I wish to explore the streets behind Coburg Square. As Holmes and Watson slowly walked past the buildings behind Jabez Wilson's shop, the street changed quickly from the shabby, quiet Coburg Square to the street became one of the city's main traffic roads, with carriages and pedestrians hurrying in both directions. As they walked, Holmes called out the names of the shops and businesses they passed. Mortimer's Tobacco Shop, the Vegetarian Restaurant. They had vegetarians back then, too? The City of Suburban Bank, and McFarland's Carriage Station Office, and now... Flip the page. Takes me longer with me hook. Watson, that does it. We're ready for lunch. And then off to the violin concert, where there are no red-headed clients to bother us. That afternoon, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson sat in St. James Concert Hall with the great detective, himself a talented musician and composer. Waving his long, thin fingers, I'd demonstrate for you, but I've got this here hook. Then, when the concert was over and Holmes and Watson were leaving the hall, Holmes finally brought up Jabez Wilson's case again. I believe, Watson, that a serious crime is being planned, but I feel that we have a chance of stopping it. Today, being Saturday, might complicate matters, but I shall need your help. Just be at Baker Street at 10 tonight and kindly bring your army revolver. Sounds interesting. With a wave of his hand, Holmes turned on his heels and disappeared into the crowd. Boy, if I was Watson, I'd be a little irritated. I'd want to know more about what was going on than just bring a revolver. Watson stood outside the concert hall for several minutes, bewildered. What kind of a stupid dolt am I? He muttered to himself. I have seen and heard everything that Holmes has seen, and yet he seems to know exactly what has happened and what is about to happen, while I am completely confused. As he rode home in a cab, Watson tried to puzzle it all out, but rather than Holmes's hint that Vincent Spaulding, the pawnbroker's assistant, was a shrewd and dangerous man, Watson could figure out nothing. Dr. Watson left his home at 9:15, arriving at 221 Baker Street. He saw no hansom cabs, and standing at the door of the detective's home... Oh, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Must be me eye patch. He saw 2 hansom cabs standing at the door of the detective's homes. As Watson entered the house, he found Sherlock deep in conversation with 2 men. Watson recognized one as Peter Jones, a police inspector from Scotland Yard. Scotland Yard is a famous detective place. And the other man, a tall, thin man with a long, dark coat and shiny hat, was a stranger. Our party is complete, said Holmes as Watson entered. My dear Watson, you know Mr. Jones of Scotland Yard. Jones and Watson smiled and shook hands. And let me introduce you, Watson, to Mr. Merriweather, who will be our companion in tonight's adventure. Ooh, it's getting really exciting with an adventure. A pirate is always up for an adventure. As he spoke, Holmes was buttoning up his pea jacket and taking his heavy hunting crop from the rack. I hope this does not wind up as a wild goose chase, said Mr. Merriweather gloomily. You can have confidence in Sherlock Holmes, said Inspector Jones. His ways may be a bit unusual, sir, but he is most often quicker and more successful in solving cases than our police force. All right, Inspector Jones, said Mr. Merriweather, if you say so. Still, I must confess that I shall miss my card game at my club. Pooh, on the card game. This is more exciting. It's the first Saturday night in 27 years. I shall not be there. He needs a little more excitement in his life than cards, anyways. I think you will find yourself playing for higher stakes tonight than you have ever played for before, said Holmes. And that play will be more exciting. For you, Mr. Merriweather, the stakes will be $30,000. And for you, Inspector Jones, the stakes will be a criminal you have been seeking for years. That is so, Mr. Holmes, said the Inspector Jones. For years I've been following the trail of John Clay, the murderer, thief, and forger with no luck. He's a young man, but he's the top of his profession. A pity, too, for his grandfather was a royal duke, and young Clay has been to Eton and Oxford, two of England's finest schools. His brain is as cunning as his fingers, and I've never even managed to set my eyes on him. Then I hope I shall have the pleasure of introducing you to Mr. John Clay tonight, said Holmes. And now, Inspector, it is time to leave. If you and Mr. Merriweather will ride in the first hansom cab, Watson and I will follow in the second. During the drive along London's gaslit streets, Sherlock Holmes sat humming the music he had heard that afternoon. Ooh, there's a picture right here of them leaving the house. All right. Watson could contain himself no longer, and he burst out, Holmes, where are we going, and why are Inspector Jones and Mr. Merriweather, whoever he is, going with us? My dear Watson, we are very close now. This fellow Merriweather is a bank director, and so, personally, I am interested in this matter. And as for Jones, even though he's an absolute imbecile as a policeman, ooh, that's an insult. An imbecile means he's an idiot. He's as brave as a bulldog and never lets go of his victims once he's captured him. Ah, here we are, and they're waiting for us. The cab stopped in the street around the corner from Jabez Wilson's pawnbroker shop, and Holmes, Watson, and Inspector Jones followed Mr. Merriweather down a narrow alley through a side door which he unlocked for them. They walked through a small corridor until a massive iron gate stopped them. Mr. Merriweather opened his key and opened this, too, with a key, and led the three men down a flight of winding stone steps. Mr. Merriweather stopped to light a lantern, revealing another iron gate. He unlocked this, too, and the four men entered a huge cellar piled high with crates and huge boxes. This vault cannot be reached from above, said Holmes, as he took the lantern and studied the cellar room. Nor from below, said Mr. Merriweather, striking his stick on the flagstones lining the floor. Then he gasped and looked up in surprise. Why, it sounds hollow. You'll have to be quiet, said Holmes severely. Any noise can ruin the success of my plan. Now please, Mr. Merriweather, sit down on one of the crates and try not to interfere. The banker, looking a bit hurt, perched himself on a crate, while Holmes fell to his knees and, with the lantern and magnifying glass, began to examine the cracks between the stones. After a few seconds, he sprang to his feet and put the glass in his pocket. We have an hour to wait, said Holmes, for they won't do anything until the good pawnbroker is in bed. Then they will get to work. Turning to Watson, Holmes said, And now, Watson, as you have probably guessed, we are in the cellar of one of the major London banks. Mr. Merriweather is the chairman of the directors of that bank, and so I'll let him explain to you why these daring criminals, are so interested in this cellar right now. It's our French gold, whispered Mr. Merriweather. We are warned that an attempt might be made to steal it. French gold? Asked Watson, puzzled. Yes, some months ago, to strengthen our bank's resources, we borrowed £30,000 in gold from the Bank of France. We never had need to unpack the money, so it's still lying in these crates in the cellar. And now, said Holmes, we must arrange our plans. First, Mr. Merryweather, we must darken the lantern. We cannot risk a light. Next, we must choose our positions. These are daring men who will not think twice about harming us, so we must be careful. I shall stand behind this crate, and the rest of you are to conceal yourselves behind some others. Oh, very, very good plan. As soon as I flash a light on the criminals, those in attack, and if they fire, Watson, shoot them down. Watson cocked his revolver and placed it on the crate behind which he was crouching. As soon as the others were in place, Holmes slid the crate across the front of his lantern and left everyone in pitch darkness. They can retreat only in one direction, Holmes whispered to Watson. That is through Mr. Wilson's house. But Inspector Jones has 3 officers waiting at the front door, and now we must be silent and wait. As an hour went by, then an hour and a quarter, Watson's legs grew stiff, for he was afraid to change his position. Suddenly, a glint of light sparked the stone floor. It lengthened into a yellow line. Then, without a sound, the opening widened and a hand appeared. A white, almost womanly hand. Its fingers felt around the stone floor, then quickly disappeared, and everything went dark again, except for one spark between the stones. Ooh, here's another picture of them coming out. Great. A moment later, one of the broad flagstones turned over on its side with a smashing sound. Over the edge peeped a clean-cut, boyish face which looked carefully about. Then, with a hand on hand either side of the opening, the fellow lifted himself up and out of the hole. Reaching back in, he lifted out a small, agile companion with a pale face and a head full of fiery red hair. It's all clear, whispered the first man. Bring up the chisel and the bags and... Great Scott! Jump, Archie! Get away while I hold them off! Uh-oh. Sherlock Holmes had sprung from behind a crate and grabbed the first young man by the collar. The other dived back into the hole, avoiding the clutch of Inspector Jones, who was left with only a torn piece of cloth from the man's coat in his hand. The first man, John Clay, tried to pull out his revolver, but Holmes's hunting crop came down on his wrist and the pistol clanked to the floor. It's no use, John Clay, said Holmes. You cannot escape. So I see, answered Clay, but at least my pal got away. But you're wrong, cried Holmes. There are 3 men waiting for him at the door to Mr. Wilson's house. You seem to have thought of everything. I must compliment you, said Clay. Who ever heard of a villain who's this polite? And I must compliment you, too, John Clay, or Vincent Spaulding, said Holmes. Your red-headed idea was quite ingenious. Inspector Jones reached for Clay's wrist and locked them together with a pair of handcuffs. Do not touch me with your filthy hands, said Clay coldly. I have royal blood in my veins, and I wish to be addressed as sir, and with the word please. Ha! Cried Jones with a sneer. Well, will you please, sir, march upstairs where I can place your highness in a royal cab and take you to the police station. That's better, said Clay with a bow, and he walked off with the police inspector. Mr. Merryweather turned to Sherlock Holmes and said, Really, Mr. Holmes, I don't know how the bank can repay you. Just cover my expenses, Mr. Merryweather, said Holmes. I've had 1 or 2 little scores of my own to settle with Mr. John Clay, and it has been a unique and remarkable experience matching his wits with the Red-Headed League. Later in the early hours of the morning, as Holmes and Watson sat over a glass of whiskey and soda in Holmes's sitting room, the detective explained, You see, Watson, it was obvious from the start that the only possible purpose for the League's newspaper advertisement and the copying of the encyclopedia was to get Jabez Wilson out of his pawn shop for several hours every day. The method probably occurred to Clay by his accomplice's red hair and Jabez Wilson's own red hair. Surely, paying the not-too-bright pawnbroker paying the pawnbroker £4 a week was nothing when they stood to gain £30,000. John Clay's partner rented the temporary office as Duncan Ross or William Morris, while Clay himself as Vincent Spaulding urged Jabez Wilson to answer the league's advertisement. In that way, they made certain that Jabez Wilson was out every morning, giving them time to dig, added Watson. But tell me, Holmes, what made you first suspicious? When I first heard that Vincent Spaulding had agreed to work for Mr. Wilson for half pay, I figured he had a strong motive for getting the job. But how did you guess the motive? I immediately ruled out robbery of Wilson's home or pawn shop, for there was nothing of great value for these criminals to make such elaborate plans and spend the money they did. So I decided it must be something out of the house. But what? Then I remembered Wilson telling us of Spaulding's interest in photography and his frequent disappearances into the cellar. Yes, Watson, the cellar was the clue. Vincent Spaulding had to be doing something in the cellar. Something which took many hours each day for up to months. Only thing I could come up with was that he was digging a tunnel or some other building. And how did you make sure, Holmes? When we first visited Coburg Square, I tapped my walking stick on the pavement in front of Jabez Wilson's pawn shop to see if the cellar was in front or in back, added Wilson, pleased now to understand the great detective. Ah, here's another picture of them digging their hole. Yes, Watson, it was not in front. Then I rang the bell, and as I stopped, Spaulding answered it. I had come up against him in cases before, but we had never met face to face. Besides, it wasn't his face I looked at when he opened the door. It was his knees. Ah, cried Watson, those wrinkled, dirt-stained, warm-pant knees told you that he had been on his hands and knees digging. Yes, that's the only remaining question. That was what they were tunneling for. So, Watson, after we left Vincent Spaulding, we walked around the corner, and I observed the shops. Then I realized that the City and Suburban Bank backed up against Jabez Wilson's shop, and I knew I had the answer. And the business you had to take care of? After the concert, asked Watson, I went to Scotland Yard, and with Inspector Jones called upon Mr. Merriweather. And how could you be so sure that Spaulding or Gray would attempt the robbery tonight? When they closed the office of the Red-Headed League, that was a sign that they no longer needed to keep Jabez Wilson out of the house. In other words, the tunnel was finished. They had to use it quickly, for it might be discovered, or the gold might be removed to another bank. Saturday would be good, for it would give them a full day on Sunday to make their escape before the bank opened on Monday. That is how I responded. I reasoned they would attempt the robbery tonight. Amazing, Holmes! You reasoned it out beautifully. Ah, well, Watson, said Holmes with a yawn, it saved me from boredom. But now I shall have to be bored again till the next case comes along to challenge my wits. All right, that was the end of the Red-Headed League. Interesting story. Not sure if I'm a fan of Holmes, though. Kind of an odd duck. And the next one, when you come back on Monday, will be, it looks like, The Adventures of the Speckled Band. All right. Until next time, all, I hope you better be reading.